Welcome everyone, and a particularly warm welcome to General Wayne Eyre, who is Canada's Chief of the Defence Staff. General Eyre attended Royal Roads Military College, Victoria, and Royal Military College of Canada, Kingston. Upon commissioning in 1988, he joined Second Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, and has spent the majority of his career in various command or deputy command positions. He became the commander of the Canadian Army in August of 2019 and was appointed as acting chief of the defense staff in February 2021. And then General Eyre was appointed chief of the defense staff in November of 2001. General Eyre, thank you very much for joining us here at the Center for Strategic International Studies.
Seth, thanks for having me, and it's great to see you again here.
Yes, it is. It's great to see you. I think the last time I saw you was in Ottawa. So good to see you now in Washington. I guess this means the next time I'll have to come back up to Ottawa.
Always welcome.
All right. Well, let me just first start off. The U.S. Canadian defense relationship goes back generations. We fought together in World War II. After the 9/11 attacks, I know it's been memorialized in a fantastic musical that's not just on Broadway, but here in Washington, Come From Away, the camaraderie between the U.S. and the Canadian populations after 9/11. But the National Defense Strategy on the U.S. side outlines a very different and evolving security environment from that post-9/11 period. It's one where, at least from the U.S. perspective, China is the main pacing threat, to use the defense strategy's terminology. Russia's an acute threat. And then there are others: Iran, North Korea, terrorist organizations, pandemics, climate change, which brings us to the Arctic and other issues. But how do you see the evolving security environment from your vantage point in Canada?
Hey, Seth, that's a great question. But I will go back to your first point about us standing shoulder to shoulder for a long time. It goes back before World War II, World War I. We fought together. In fact, even before U.S. was officially part of the war, you had thousands of your citizens who came north to join our battalions, our regiments that were part of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. And since then, we've stood shoulder to shoulder in many conflict areas in the world. In the last quarter century, I've been deployed on 4 operations where I've had Americans above me and below me in the chain of command, and I've had the opportunity of spending 4 postings down here. So it's a tight relationship. The world, from our perspective, is becoming a more dangerous place. The world international security order is under threat. That rules-based international order that has underpinned our prosperity for the last 7+ decades is increasingly under threat. And what we're facing are a series of adversarial states, authoritarian states, who seek to sow disorder and discontent in Western liberal democracies, not so much to convince those that are sitting on the fence, but more so to convince their own populations that, hey, their system is the best. And that's because their existential threat is not from without, it comes from within. And so we're seeing a lot of that. And I believe, and certainly the rest of my career, and probably the rest of my life, is going to be one in the security environment characterized by confrontation. So we've got the changes in the geopolitical order, threats to the geopolitical order that we are facing. And we collectively need to stand up, deter, defend that order, because our national prosperity is based on it. You know, I believe that the competitive advantage we have is being a group of like-minded or like-minded enough friends, partners, allies who see the world in a very similar way and can stand together. The other side, they don't have friends, partners, allies. They have clients and vassals. And so that's important in terms of values and what we aspire to. The other complicating factor in the security environment is climate change. And it's not just the domestic emergencies and natural disasters that are causing us so much focus, so much attention, so much draw on our resources, but it's also opening up, in our case, the Arctic to further exploitation. But it's also causing human migration and and conflict around the world as well. So that is part of the security environment that is nested on top of this, this great power competition, this confrontation. The other piece is the rapidly, you could almost say, accelerating change of technological development. Technology is just changing so fast, so it's changing the character of war and warfare, and operations writ large, and staying abreast of that is super important. And I guess the final piece of the security environment that's got me quite concerned are the upheavals in our societies. We see the polarization. We see the misinformation and disinformation that's happening out there. And it's tearing, in some cases, the fabric of our liberal democracies, where the institutions of our democracies are under increasing threat. So those four aspects combined present a pretty dark future that we have to be ready for.
Well, we'll talk about various components that you just outlined, talk about the Arctic, talk about some of the emerging technologies that we're focused on, you're focused on developing, but also we see a lot of competition because we see the Chinese, for example, focused on a range of emerging technologies as well. One of the things that does strike me, and I take it as a glass half full issue, is that despite the challenges, certainly within the U.S. society and the polarization, we still share, the U.S. and Canada, a strong commitment, despite all that, to democracy and freedom of the press, freedom of information, freedom of religion, and an open capitalist system. And I think even the challenges that the U.S. has faced domestically over the past several years, we're still there. We're still a democratic country. We still will have democratic elections. And I think my hope is that that continues to bind both of our countries together, because as you outlined, this is in part, maybe to a great degree, a competition of ideologies, different types of political and economic systems.
No, I fully agree with you. And our two countries are joined by geography, history, culture that is far closer than it is different, and language. And so we're not going away from each other.
Well, one issue that has definitely changed this year has been the Russian decision to invade Ukraine. It has certainly created a major stir, but we've seen across the NATO alliance, including both the U.S. and the Canadians, a response to provide assistance to the Ukrainians in their hour of danger. So can you talk a little bit about Canada's role in providing assistance to the Ukrainians? I know you've been dealing directly with this issue. How would you characterize it from types of systems provided to training to other activities?
No, that's a great question, Seth. And let me give you some background, first of all. So Canada was the first country to recognize Ukrainian independence back 30 years ago. In 2015, after the Russian invasion and seizure of parts of the Donbass and Crimea, we started a training mission called Operation Unifier, where we focused on developing junior leaders, developing NCO and officer corps, developing combined arms skills, and specialist skills such as medical and engineering and military police. And that has been a successful mission, which continues to this date. You know, why is it important to Canada? We have the third largest Ukrainian population outside of Ukraine itself or Russia. So we have, you know, sizable diaspora in the country. So there is that tie. But there's also shared values of democracy, of wanting national sovereignty. And so this has been a pretty natural for us. You know, since the invasion back in February, we have continued with Operation Unifier. You know, right now, I believe we've got 8 lines of effort happening in 7 or 8 different countries. You know, just last Friday, I was over in the UK watching our training of Ukrainian recruits in conjunction with the British. Fantastic to see. These Ukrainian recruits, they're motivated, they're extremely absorbent of the lessons, the skills that we are imparting. We're just about to start engineering training with our Polish colleagues. And we have a number of other lines of effort that are ongoing. In terms of donations, I believe we rank number 5 in the world for what we've donated, both in terms of lethal and non-lethal aid. We've donated small arms, artillery systems, ammunition, armored vehicles, and
155 millimeter, for example.
155 millimeter, and plus training. In fact, we trained Ukrainian gunners on Canadian, American, and Australian guns that were donated to the M777s. The training is something we're particularly proud of, and is something that we will continue to look for opportunities to deliver.
Great. One of the issues that certainly has come up, and it has led to a range of communications between U.S. and Russian leadership, is the statements that President Putin has made about nuclear weapons use. How significant of a development would the Russian decision to use a nuclear weapon on the battlefield be? It would be obviously the first time any country since 1945 were to use a nuclear weapon. What would the broader implication be?
Well, as you implied, this would be extremely serious and a game changer. But that being said, we cannot allow nuclear coercion stop us from doing the right thing. And the right thing is supporting Ukraine in its time of need. Because let's face it, other countries are watching as well. And if nuclear coercion works this time, well, it'll work the next time. And so supporting Ukraine throughout this, we cannot lose our resolve.
To what degree, we are starting to see and have seen over the last couple of weeks what I'll call sabotage and subversive operations. I'm thinking of Russian operations. There's been a threat also to transatlantic cables, certainly a threat of offensive cyber attacks. To what degree are you also prepared to defend against these kinds of irregular, asymmetric attacks against Canada in response?
Well, this is something that we need to be increasingly concerned about. Horizontal escalation as otherwise undefended assets are targeted. We've got to be very concerned about those single points of failure for our societies. You know, whether it's in the energy sector, the communications sector, the transportation sector. And so identifying and protecting those critical assets is critical. But at the same time, eliminating single points of failure. And so building redundancy and thus resilience into the system. Deterrence by resilience, if you will.
One of the issues you mentioned earlier, General, is the Arctic. The U.S. National Defense Strategy highlights the Arctic and climate change more broadly. You mentioned it briefly in your opening remarks. Can you talk a little bit about, from the Canadian perspective, to how important the Arctic is from a defense standpoint, too, and where do you see competition headed in the Arctic? Because, there's been growing concern that, for example, the Chinese present a threat. The timelines can be debated on whether it's immediate, more immediate, but that they are preparing to send, some have argued, nuclear-powered cruise submarines. What's your extent? Well, first of all, how important is it to you, and then what does competition look like, and how do you help manage that?
So this is another area of focus for us, of increasing focus in the changing world security environment. The Arctic is becoming increasingly important, especially coupled with the geopolitical situation and climate change, which makes it more accessible. Say we don't have a threat to our sovereignty today, tomorrow, or next year, but that may change in the decades ahead as it becomes more accessible. And so what that means for us is we have to invest in those long lead capabilities. Infrastructure is one prime example, to ensure that we've got the platforms to be able to project capabilities from the south to the north, to be able to ensure that sovereignty. What does competition look like? Well, I think it's going to be more of a competition over resources, because let's face it, that's one of the world's last untapped frontiers, unexplored frontiers. And as resource challenges hit the world, this is one place where it could come under competition. So being able to protect our sovereignty and collectively protect our sovereignty is important. I will say for the first time since 2013, in August, we hosted the Arctic Chiefs of Defense Conference. I hosted it in Newfoundland, less Russia, of course. And for the first time in 9 years, we were able to discuss some of the common security challenges that we face, and we had broad agreement about what those security challenges are, and broad agreement that we have to work together to not only ensure the Arctic is secure, but do our part to ensure that it doesn't become an area of tension. How can we keep the tension down in that area? How can we avoid miscalculation and not turn it to a zone of conflict? I think has got to be top of the priority list as well.
And to what degree do you see growing cooperation between some of the key partners and allies on Arctic issues? There's always been some tendency for countries to operate in their own self-interest. But this area, partly because it's a global commons, I think there's an important aspect of this that needs to be cooperative in general.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. For our part, we have an annual exercise called Operation Nanook. And we're seeing growing allied international participation in that exercise from a range of countries, either full participants or observers, and we welcome them. We welcome the ability to cooperate, to work together in that part of the world. Going back to the U.S. Canadian relationship, we've just announced the modernization of aspects of North American air defense, NORAD. And for our part, that's a significant component of what we call continental defense, with emphasis on the Arctic.
Well, let me jump on this for a second. So I think it was June, Prime Minister Trudeau visited NORAD headquarters in Colorado Springs. Mm-hmm. And then the Canadian Minister of Defense subsequently announced that it would spend roughly $5 billion over the next 6 years to upgrade the North Warning System, including the over-the-horizon radars. We've talked extensively to the U.S. NORTHCOM commander, General Van Herk, who's highlighted, at least from the U.S. perspective, concerns about long-range Russian cruise missiles and other aerial threats coming from the high north. Mm-hmm. So I've got two questions, but I'll start with the first, which is, can you talk us through what you see as the threat in the high north that is driving this kind of an investment, and some insights into what you're planning to spend that money on?
Mm-hmm. So firstly, for clarification, it's as you mentioned, for 6 years, but for 20 years, it's about $39 billion. And so NORAD modernization focused on a number of areas. One is domain awareness, air domain awareness. So over-the-horizon radars, polar over-the-horizon radar, working in conjunction with the U.S. as we map out the sites to ensure that these detectors these sensors are integrated and have got overlapping coverage. Command and control is a key aspect of it. So ensuring that we are networked, we've got the latest technology that can help us affect command and control and link with our allies as well. Investments in things like infrastructure. So we've got the forward operating locations that can handle increased requirements based on new aircraft, increased tankers, air weapons. And then an R&D component because of the evolving nature of the threat. You asked about the threat. Well, it's number of threats through the Arctic. So missiles, cruise missiles, hypersonics, and technology continues to advance. And thus, it's important to get those sensors in place, but it's also important to have an R&D component so that we can continue to evolve our own capability at pace with adversaries.
So on the R&D side, how much of this effort, because this is a big discussion in the U.S. as well, might include active defense? So, the ability to defend against these missiles, in addition to just the sensing and warning.
Mm-hmm. So I don't think that's been defined yet as part of the overall R&D plan. That being said, it is a very, very important aspect of it. You got to be able to detect, you got to be able to decide, and you got to be able to act.
Yeah, because I think one of the issues we certainly see from the Ukraine war right now is the threat posed by long-range standoff weapons. Not always precision-guided ones, but certainly long-range weapon systems.
But it also shows a plethora of different threats that are out there.
That's right.
You know, aircraft, missiles, drones.
Right, drones, UAVs, loitering munitions, some of the smaller ones as well. One of the issues that I know our Army, our Air Force, our Marine Corps, and our Navy have had to deal with are recruiting and retention challenges in this environment. I think the Canadians have dealt with some similar challenges with recruiting and retention. So, how would you characterize the challenge that you face right now? How are you dealing with it, and how does it impact things like readiness right now? Because I think those are all issues that we're certainly struggling with right now.
And I think many of the militaries across the West are struggling with this right now. It's a very tight job market. And every industry, especially in Canada, every industry is looking for workers. Coming out of the pandemic, we're facing challenges as our recruiting was down. We're seeing what's been called up north the Great Resignation. I think you're calling it the Great Retirement here in the
Great Retirement,
US,
yeah.
where many are looking at different job opportunities. We've got to take a very close look to see what our offer is. There's no way as a military that we can compete with private industry solely on financial compensation. But what else can we offer? And I call it quality of service. And a number of components to that. Purpose. Hey, there's no greater transcendent purpose than defending your country, than serving your country, and serving it with a group of like-minded teammates. Secondly, meaningful work. Going off, traveling to different parts of the world, seeing tangible results from what you do. You have meaning each and every day. Part of that with the new generation also is working in work-life balance. And so we've got to make sure we're mindful of that. Thirdly, a respectful, inclusive workplace. Like your military, we've been racked with sexual misconduct allegations, charges, which we're working extremely hard to address to make sure that everybody is welcome in this organization. Very, very important for us is 22% of Canadians, 23% I think at the last count, are foreign born. And so the demographics, the face of Canada is changing, and we've got to make sure we're an organization that can attract and retain that talent from wherever it may be. Financial security is another one. You're not going to get rich doing this, but you've got to be rich enough. So you're not worried about your family security. Yeah. And then finally, modern enough equipment to be able to operate on. Given the pace of technological change, we're perhaps not going to have the latest piece off the assembly line, but modern enough. And I think those aspects in combination can make a pretty powerful argument. But we have work to do in all of those.
We've also had to deal with not large numbers, they're actually quite small, but we've had to deal with some domestic extremism within the U.S. military. Where that's probably quantitatively we've seen a jump is as a percentage of total terrorist plots and attack. We saw a jump last year in 2021 from about 1% or so of all terrorist attacks and plots involving active duty or reservists, and the number of veterans isn't even counted here, up to about 7%. The numbers of actually active duty or reservists in the U.S. military are still, it's a tiny fraction, but it jumped in terms of plots and attacks. I don't know to what degree that's been an issue that you've had to deal with as well. I mean, all militaries in the West and elsewhere have had to deal with the sexual assault issue and other things along those lines. I don't know to what degree you've had an extremism issue you've had to at least keep an eye on. Yeah,
we're facing the same challenges. The numbers are small, but that being said, we're a reflection of society, and if this is out in society, especially as we have a footprint across the country, there are going to be influences, both before one joins and after one joins, to radicalize with some of this extremist beliefs, behavior, and so it's something that we need to be constantly on guard for. What we did several years ago was, first of all, define it. What is it? We call it hateful conduct, and there's a spectrum of it, but being able to define something, I believe, is a first step to take action. And then educate leaders at all levels. What are the signs, symbols, actions, lexicon that we need to be on the lookout for? But like you, this is a concern, but one we need to stay on top of, because it's a threat that also constantly morphs. And when you illuminate aspects of it, it changes its symbols, its ways of operating.
Yeah, and I think it also it changes the perception, or can change the perception of the military as a good for society. So we've been involved in climate surveys and then efforts, particularly as individuals are either being recruited or after they're exiting or while they're exiting the military, to just keep an eye on some issues. But one of the comments you made before, when we were talking about retention, got me thinking to some degree about a challenge that we face, and you do as well to some degree, is on the general industrial base, including the defense industrial base. As we look at the taxation on the defense industrial base from the war in Ukraine, it's created some stress on the availability for us of javelins, of Stingers, of 155 millimeter howitzers, and ammunition. When we look at and we at CSIS have run repeated iterations of Taiwan Straits war game. We run out of long-range precision strike, LRASMs and JASMs, for example, in less than a week. I would characterize our defense industrial base as largely being one that's on a peacetime footing when we have a war in Ukraine right now, and we certainly have tensions in the Taiwan Straits. When you add to that also foreign military sales and some ITAR and no foreign restrictions on technology sharing, I think there are some broader questions about whether we've got to shift the industrial base, defense industrial base, to one that's more conducive to the environment we're in. So how do you see it from your position from Canada? How confident are you right now that the industrial base that you're seeing is adequate to where we're at right now? And if not, how do you change it, or how do you start to change it?
Yeah, so I'm very concerned. I don't think the defense industrial base for my own country is where it needs to be able to support conflict of any duration. And if we take a look at history, great power war is not short war, it's long war. So what does industrial mobilization look like in the 21st century? We've got some real challenges. There's just not the capacity there. The supply chains are much more complex than they were before, especially when we get involved in some of the higher tech components.
Microelectronics, for example.
Yeah, the rare earths that are required. Metals. Who controls those? Yeah, the chips.
I can name you the country that controls them.
Yeah, exactly. Beginning of last week, I visited 2 of our ammunition manufacturing plants, just for this very reason. Hey, what can we do to increase production? How can we get more production lines open? The challenge is it's going to take time, and it's going to take money, it's going to take commitment, long-term commitment for them to build new infrastructure, hire and train and retain new staff, develop that expertise, and so that commitment is needed as well.
How do you think about collaboration across U.S. and Canada, and more broadly about NATO countries? Because I think one of the things we're looking at, and it's certainly true across the Indo-Pacific as well, is how do we think about more efficient industrial bases, not just national ones too?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think our defense industrial base between our 2 countries is pretty tightly coupled. You know, the ammunition plants that I referred to, I was surprised how much of what they were producing was going down to support U.S. forces. And so that's, and much of the equipment we buy is from the U.S., so that's pretty tightly coupled. I think, though, especially from us as a smaller military, we've got to be very careful about making our military requirements too unique. Mm-hmm. We got to think of interoperability right at the top of the list. In fact, you can almost go to interchangeability as the next step, where we field the same type of equipment. M777s is a case in point, where it's the same system, we can swap it back and forth relatively easily.
So one follow-up question along those lines, as we've talked about industrial bases, one of the things that's been interesting as we look at a resource-constrained environment, both from a financial but also a human capital perspectives, is what do you, at least from your vantage point, what do you require, what do you think is important to regain, sustain, and maintain strategic and operational advantages over our adversaries? What are you particularly focused on?
For me, it's readiness, because we can buy the latest piece of equipment off the shelf, but if you don't have the other components of readiness, what I'm talking about are the people, the sustainment, and the training, it's going to be worthless. And so investing across all four of those pillars, the people, the equipment, the training, and the sustainment, so that you can actually produce that readiness, to be able to, the ability to respond at speed and at scale, that's the important piece. That's the important piece that will assist in deterrence. You know, the ability to show that, yeah, you can be there, and you can be there, you have endurance to be there. But you know, we talked about ammunition stockpiles. You know, same thing. That's all part of strategic readiness. That talks about your ability to endure and over the longer term.
What about on the technology or platforms or weapon systems side? Or you know, we certainly see a growing use first in the Armenia-Azerbaijan war in Nagorno-Karabakh, certainly in the Ukraine war, both from the Russian and the Ukrainian sides, a heavy emphasis on various types of UAVs.
Yeah.
And you know, when we were both collectively in Afghanistan, and I was involved certainly from a special operations standpoint, we used, say, the MQ-9s for a lot of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR, and occasionally for strike purposes. But as we've seen the evolution of UAVs, or UASs, or RPAs, whatever acronym one uses, we've seen them much more integrated into combined arms. We've seen them used for strike, but we've also seen them used for spotting, for artillery strikes, for information operations, taking the feeds off of the videos and pushing them out onto digital platforms, seen them used for electronic warfare, for bomb damage assessment, for domain awareness, as you highlighted earlier. How do you see the role of UAVs kind of changing in this emerging environment?
So I think you hit the nail on the head by the use of the term combined arms. And so the ability to integrate UAVs into the other arms that are on in the battle space is going to be of great importance. So we've gone from infantry, armored, artillery, engineers, to adding other arms, electronic warfare, air, UAVs. But it's the ability of the commander and the staff to be able to integrate those capabilities to produce that synergistic effect that combined arms is known for, or bump it up a level, joint warfare is known for. And so continuing to train and develop that ability to integrate, super important. But the use of UAVs in Ukraine has got me thinking about something else. And it's about the type of weapons we invest in. Many of the weapons we invest in are very expensive. They're high tech, but they're millions of dollars per round. And I saw this in Afghanistan, using a $2 million missile to kill somebody with an AK-47. Where's the economics? Where's the trade-off in that? And so perhaps two tracks for investment. The high-tech, exquisite weaponry, but also lower tech, but more of them, lower cost, but effective munitions. And loitering munitions, UAVs, seem to be filling some of that niche.
Well, we've certainly seen in the case, for example, of the Houthis with Iranian-supported technology in Yemen, in the strikes that have been conducted against both Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. I mean, they have used some land attack cruise missiles, but some of the UAVs that have been used are relatively inexpensive, and some of the weapon systems that the Saudis have used to conduct counter UAS or UAV have been very expensive. So there are also some trade-offs on the counter UAV or UAS side.
Yeah, and the counter UAV fight is of increasing importance in investing in that technology, but low-cost technology as well. And this is another truism of warfare. It's adaptation, counter-adaptation, back and forth. Who can adapt the fastest?
So on the future of warfare, one of the issues that has been discussed as part of the U.S.'s joint warfighting concept is the role of emerging technologies. And it's certainly something that we see the Chinese in particular looking at. But how do you see the role, for example, of artificial intelligence or quantum computing? Some of these issues, how important are they to the future of warfare? I mean, not just for precision strike, but for sensing or for communication or for a range of other aspects that are important to the warfighter.
So very important for all of those aspects you talked about. But I think of even greater significance is decision support. So the ability, as you're formulating the plan, as you're going through the operational planning process, to help you develop courses of action, to pull out hidden nuggets that you wouldn't have otherwise considered. So the way that humans make decisions could be fundamentally, in war, could be fundamentally altered by AI, improved by AI. And so I think that's where it has the greatest potential.
On the future, staying on the subject of the future of war and warfare, what are some things that you have found interesting or surprising watching the war in Ukraine unfold? I mean, there are a range of things that probably aren't that surprising. The importance of logistics, particularly in a contested environment. Yep. The Russians struggled with that, including on that famous Kyiv assault where they ran out of spare parts, fuel, a whole range of things, ammunition. Probably not surprising, the importance of long-range strike in an industrial-style war, which is a little bit different from the counterterrorism. But we also seen other things, private sector get involved. Microsoft and cyber defense.
Yep.
We've seen SpaceX and Elon Musk get involved in Starlink and providing Starlink to the Ukrainians. We've seen the Russians fumble on offensive cyber, not able to take down Ukrainian command and control systems for at least lengthy periods of time. So as you look at the way the war in Ukraine has evolved, and this is less about Ukraine per se and more about kind of where you see things evolving, what are some lessons that you take from that war?
Well, I think one of the most important ones is the use of information. The Ukrainians' very skillful use of the information environment to help gain and maintain support for their cause. And the failure of Russian disinformation, especially in the West. That being said, their disinformation is more successful in the global South, and that's an area of vulnerability that we need to be very cognizant of. I think it's also interesting to note what has not changed in enduring nature of war, if you will. So it's a contest of wills. And you can see the importance of the will of the Ukrainian people, that will to win, which is just so important. The uncertainty, the fog, the friction, it's still bloody. That's not going away. The importance, as we've evolved and we've thought about the changing character of war, thinking it's one of high tech and precision, we've seen the continuing importance of mass. And so larger numbers spread out across the battlefield, that is important. Spread out is important. Dispersion is important because the signature that many capabilities, groupings, units may put out makes it a target. So dispersion is increasingly important. Being networked, very, very important as well. So the Ukrainian use of, through Starlink of the internet and being able to use that as further command and control. So lots relearned, but lots learning as well.
So one aspect of that war, which has broader implications, and I think it certainly was a challenge from all of our collective intelligence and defense agencies, was, I'm generalizing a little bit here, but I think there's a general conclusion in the analyses that the Russians were likely to perform reasonably well when the invasion began, and the Ukrainians, it was probably just a matter of time. Now, part of the reason may have been we looked at capabilities largely, and the Russian systems, as we've taken them off the battlefield, for example, following the Kharkiv offensive, and we've looked at some of the Russian artillery, they're not bad. But the challenge has been, how do you then also, from a military perspective, when you're looking at adversaries, assess their qualitative components, morale, readiness, training, command and control initiative at a lower level. And so I think as we look at adversaries now, how do we look at some of these harder to measure factors? Because it's pretty easy to look at Chinese capabilities, for example, and to look at their fourth and fifth generation capabilities and to assume a significant danger. But as the Russians taught us, and I'm not necessarily saying the same goes for everybody, that there is a qualitative dimension to this which is a little bit more difficult. How do you see that?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and it speaks to the enduring nature of human will, and that will to fight just being so important at all levels. Say, I went over to Ukraine in December, and I had one question as we saw the intelligence, as we saw the buildup. Will they fight? And you get the answer from the chain of command. Yes, they'll fight. But more importantly, I talked to our own troops who are there training as they had been for the last 7 years, and absolutely, as they engage with the NCOs, as they engage with the junior officers. And when I've got our NCOs, our officers saying, yeah, they are invested, they're going to fight. Yeah, that confirmed it. So that was not a surprise. What was a surprise was just, and hard to determine what that will to fight is going to be like on the other side.
Yeah, especially before any shots are fired. Mm-hmm. Well, my last question is a hope that as competitive as the landscape may be, and as you have described, that we don't fight, that any adversary activity is deterred. So that concept of deterrence is fundamental in the new U.S. National Defense Strategy. The concept is integrated deterrence, but just focusing on deterrence, how do you think about deterrence in this landscape, and what factors are important to ensuring deterrence? And deterrence here for everybody really is preventing an actor from doing what it otherwise had intended to do. So not stopping them from doing an action that they're already doing, but preventing them from conducting an action, say, an invasion of Taiwan. So how do you think about deterrence and preparing for that? Mm-hmm.
Well, I think of deterrence in terms of national prosperity. And so the logic trail here is our national prosperity is predicated on stability in the international system, rules-based international order. So how do we maintain that stability? Well, it's being strong. And we're dealing with a strategic culture that views compromise as weakness, that views the willingness to sit down and negotiate as weakness as well, that views weakness is something to be exploited. So you've still got to coexist, but you can do that from a position of strength. How do you do that? Well, you engage responsibly. You're transparent about your actions. You stand shoulder to shoulder with your friends, partners, and allies. You call out bad behavior when you see it, and you constantly uphold the norms and expectations of that rules-based international order. So you avoid that gradual erosion of those norms. So call out bad behavior when and where you see it, and it's 1,000 points of contact, and you got to make sure that you address each and every one.
Well, we are at time. General Eyre, thank you very much for your time and coming to the Center for Strategic International Studies. We're often confused because our acronym is CSIS with CSIS. We are not Canadian intelligence, but thank you very much. The Canadian-American relationship runs deep for our countries collectively. For me personally, my family is Canadian, so I appreciate your time here. Thank you very much for coming, and good luck.
No, thank you, Seth.